The Lion, first among Primarchs, is the template from which all the other demigod sons of the Emperor were created. The Lord of the First Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Dark Angels, is perhaps the most exceptional loyalist being in the galaxy during the 42nd millennium. And yet, he carries with him many dark secrets, and some of the most terrible truths in Warhammer 40k, the scariest of which we will discuss in this video. While the Primarch of the First Legion has an extensive and thorough backstory, and is majorly featured in the lore of the Horus Heresy and events leading up to it, we aren't going to examine any of that in this video. I'm going to go through the Lion in Warhammer 40k, his return, his reunion with his sons the Dark Angels, and their successor chapters, the Unforgiven, as well as what he's done, who he's fought, and ultimately what his return to the setting means for the future of Warhammer 40,000. If you haven't read The Lion, Son of the Forest, the Arcs of Omen campaign books, and the 10th edition Dark Angels Codex, this video will spoil major events from those books. The Lion awoke in what was seemingly a medieval forest, basically a mirror of Caliban, where he neither knew where he was nor who he was. The Primarch had total amnesia. As he slowly made his way through the life he had newly awakened to, it soon became obvious to him that he was an exceptional being. His only guide in life was one of the Watchers in the Dark, the diminutive Xenos race that helps the Dark Angels and was ostensibly native to Caliban. After many trials and tribulations, the Lion recovers his memories and begins to piece together what happened to him and his legion, and starts his plans for how to remedy everything that went wrong. This leads him on a major redemption arc, where he seeks out his wayward sons, the fallen Dark Angels, for only the Primarch can truly, in his opinion, pass judgment on his sons. So he picks up the Emperor's shield on the way, which can reflect any damage done to it back on the attacker, a gift from his father that became real in the weird webway-like semi-quasi-dimension that he found himself in. But he carried it out into real space, proving that the Emperor can manifest things into the Lion's Forest dimension that are real. But what is a shield without a sword? After all, the Lion is a knight, literally. So of course L. Johnson receives a sword worthy of him. Okay, I'm still pissed at Gilliman for snapping the Lion sword over his knee, but honestly this new sword may just be even better. Fealty. And it is literally Excalibur in space in like every way. If you're familiar with Arthurian legends at all, then you'll recognize this immediately. But it is well done and it is awesome. Lion pulls the sword from the stone, and now with the Emperor's shield and the sword fealty, he sets out on his mission of being the ultimate badass in the galaxy. This is where he is currently, but how he got there starts when he gets in touch with his wayward sons, starting with the fallen angel Zabriel. And this doesn't go so well at first, as Zabriel literally tries to kill the Lion on sight. They battle, and the Lion is able to subdue the fallen angel, but before he can kill his wayward son, the regular humans that Zabriel lives with come out and stop the Lion. They stay his hand and plead with him, making him realize that if regular, non-tainted Chaos folk are willing to make the case that Zabriel was their protector, well, then there's more going on than is readily apparent on the surface. And that is exactly the case. As Zabriel and the Lion talk, they both come to realize that the other are not traitors, that the Fallen and the rest of the First Legion fell out and fired upon each other based on a lie. That only the leadership of the Fallen had gone over to Chaos, so only Luther and a few others were really to blame. But this is where the Lion sort of starts to do some stuff that is rather out of character for him. He stops and thinks things through, something the Primarch wasn't exactly known for back during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Lion realizes that Zabriel assumed the Primarch was either there to kill him or a warp entity parading as him and also there to kill him. So he immediately forgave Zabriel for his indiscretion, and then makes the Space Marines swear an oath of fealty, and swear that he did not know the First Legion was still loyal, and it was a misunderstanding that the Fallen fired on the Legion during the Battle of Caliban. And Zabriel did so swear. But then he made the Lion swear the same. Primarch or not, the Space Marine had not trusted his father for hundreds of years of perceived time. And the Lion literally swore he was not a traitor either, and regained Zabriel's respect, though it was touchy and edgy at first. And this is very jarring for the Lion, as he has to accept some horrible truths, and one very, very dark secret that he wasn't even admitting to himself. Zabriel reminds him, and I think this is like the key breakthrough moment for the Lion, where he starts his own personal redemption arc and self-betterment. But yeah, Zabriel reminds him that on Caliban, during the Civil War between the forces of Luther and the forces of the Lion, that the Loyalist side was not blameless, and that the Lion himself had innocent blood on his hands. Zabriel had watched as new recruits who had never even seen their Primarch in person were cut down by the Lion like wheat, as he mindlessly butchered his way through his problems instead of trying to figure out the truth before overreacting. And this was a big moment. The Lion realized that he was totally awful, that he was no better than any of his sons that he and the Dark Angels had called traitor. This is when the Lion woke up and decided to reclaim his truth. He decided that he had set a poor example for his sons, and he took it seriously, wanting to dedicate his life and his time to healing his legion as best he could. So Zabriel was not only scattered through space when the warp storm destroyed Caliban, but he was flung through time as well. And when he came out of the warp storm, it was near the current timeline, and he was only kicking around in the galaxy for a few hundred years, where some of the other Fallen had been active for millennia. Zabriel was absolutely hunted down by his former brothers of the current Dark Angels chapter, and the Unforgiven successor chapters as well. So being taken under the wing of the Primarch and literally forgiven by him, Zabriel becomes the first of the Risen, Lionel Johnson's elite inner circle of former Fallen. And Lion and Zabriel go all over the galaxy using the Lion's Forest Walk ability. He just seems drawn to his former sons, and some wind up seeking redemption, renounce Luther and the Fallen, and join back up with the Lion. As long as they weren't chaos tainted, the Lion is willing to take his sons back. And those who don't wish to rejoin the fold are allowed to walk away and choose their own path as long as they so swear to aid humanity and not to harm or hinder it. But most either choose to join the Lion, as it means not only forgiveness, but that they won't be hunted by the Ravenwing and Deathwing relentlessly across the galaxy any longer, or to fight him and his newly acquired posse of old school homies. Now I have to say that I relate to this guy more than just about any other character ever. I've had amnesia myself from a car wreck. I mean, I didn't even recognize my own mom when I saw her. It took a long time to get back what I am now assuming was most of my memories. I've had my oldest friends become my most hated enemies over misperceptions, lies, and misunderstandings, only to sort those out many years later when we all came to our senses and decided to talk. And I've had many of my closest homies pass away, leaving me in a world with only tertiary friends with questionable loyalty. Yeah, the Lion's story is basically my own. Oh yeah, and I can also really identify with the uncrowned princes, what the Dark Angels were called before their Primarch reunited with the Legion after being found by the Emperor. I mean, my great-great-grandfather was literally an emperor himself. What did you think, it was just a YouTube handle? Nope, I'm the namesake of Tsar Alexander III, and I know what it is like to see the empire your family should be inheriting go from being in terrible peril to a stinking pile of shit. Imagine waking up 10,000 years after being horribly wounded and placed into a magical deep sleep by the Watchers in the Dark. You fought for centuries to expand the Imperium and unify human worlds across the galaxy in the name of the Imperial Truth, an atheistic creed imposed by the Emperor. But you've awakened into an Imperium that is crumbling, decaying from within, and entirely based on the most extreme superstition and dogma imaginable. A fascist state where the Emperor, if not truly a god yet, is definitely in the process of becoming one. And the Emperor Father, who you fought so hard for and sacrificed so much for, is now only sustained by consuming the literal souls of thousands of psychers a day. A cosmic horror, an unimaginable monster from the darkest depths of Lovecraft's mind or something like it. That doesn't sit too well with the Lion. So he goes about simply making the galaxy a better place wherever he goes. He eventually finds, though, that the very planet where he first came back into real space, Kamarth, is now under the influence of one of the lost sons who fell to chaos, the sorcerer Seraphax. And Seraphax is carving out a mini empire and has taken several worlds, and is the leader of a group of Chaos Fallen known as the 10,000 Eyes Warband. And Seraphax is extremely powerful. He has a dark and deceptive plan that, unlike many villains in Warhammer, he put a lot of thought into. Seraphax wants to remove the lion's soul from his body and puppet the corpse like a marionette using sorcery. And his silly plan was then to use the lion's body to approach the Emperor and kill his physical body. Wow. This is where Seraphax thinks that he's going to free the Emperor's soul to ascend to godhood in the warp and utterly destroy chaos. The guy is so corrupted it's ridiculous. While Seraphax has used his sorcery through the centuries to keep the taint of the warp and mutations among the 10,000 eyes to a minimum, he himself has become too far gone. Half his head is wreathed in warp fire constantly. It doesn't consume his flesh, but it is a constant burning on half his face and head, a small price he has to pay for the favor of the dark gods. But where Seraphax is beyond redemption, his warband is not necessarily evil or even all corrupted. And in his own twisted way, he thinks he is doing the only thing that will revive the Emperor. So he really thinks he's doing the right thing. But that's what someone whose mind has been warped by Tzeentch would think. When the lion and his risen sons arrive on the world of Sable to confront the warriors of the 10,000 Eyes, they pretty much get their butts kicked by Seraphax. He grabs the lion in warp chains and shackles him and is intending to suck the lion's soul out. And the lion doesn't even get to defeat the sorcerer himself. Seraphax's second in command, a lieutenant named Baelor, stabs Seraphax in the back and redeems himself. He had never succumbed to chaos, despite being second to Seraphax, and indeed the sorcerer had used his powers to prolong Baelor's life as it was, keeping the taint of the warp at bay for centuries. But even as close as they were, Baelor knew they were on the wrong side of things, and that his brother was either crazy or on more space coke than Lord Excrucius of the Emperor's Children. What Seraphax became was something horrific and awesome, a terrible nightmare, and it made Baelor really see firsthand what not only he himself had supported, but also what the 10,000 Eyes had become and had always been about. So Baelor presents himself as a knight seeking forgiveness after saving the lion and the risen by slaying Seraphax. And the lion forgives him and states he wants Baelor to rejoin the Dark Angels as one of his risen. But Baelor reveals the dark truth that he is dying slowly, corrupted at last by the demon-infused warp blade he used to slay Seraphax with. And so he asked that the lion grant him a quick death, so he didn't degrade into a corrupted Chaos Marine, slowly becoming what he hated. And the lion granted Baelor that, as a kindness. It was actually pretty touching and really sad. It was at this point in the story that the lion goes back to the Mirror Caliban and eventually is forced to confront a major demon who is able to shapeshift into the form of each of his brother Primarchs in turn and taunt him. Eventually he defeats this demon or warp entity, whatever it was, and he is able to claim another prize. Like fealty, which he pulled from the stone in a total King Arthur Excalibur moment, the lion is rewarded with the Shield of the Emperor, an artifact belonging once to his father and now granted to him. As Guilliman was granted the sword, the lion is granted the shield. And this thing is exactly what he would have needed to defeat Seraphax. It was after he receives this boon that the lion becomes aware that the Blood Angels are looking for him, as rumors of his return has spread throughout the Imperium Nihilus. At this point, the lion is not fully aware of the state of affairs of the Imperium. Eventually, he meets up with the Blood Angels and befriends their chapter master Dante, who shares with the lion some key information after an awkward introduction. But ultimately, the lion learns that Guilliman lives and runs the Imperium, which he's really happy to hear. And this is where things get crazy. It is at this point when we go from Mike Brooks' Son of the Forest novel to the Arcs of Omen storyline that happened at the end of the 9th edition of Warhammer 40k. And it's quite a doozy. If you've been following the Dark Angels lore as long as I have, or or longer, as many of you were playing them even in 2nd edition 40k, then you know that the Lion forgiving his fallen sons that will accept redemption is a huge thing. It changes much about the Dark Angels. After all, their whole thing is hunting the fallen and being very, very secretive about it. But that is all changing. One of the sacred tropes of Warhammer that has existed for decades that is getting the treatment the community has been begging for years. The Dark Angels and their secrecy are entering a new era, where the dynamics are completely being redefined. And I, for one, believe that is going to lead to some seriously messed up things happening, because it is Warhammer 40k after all, and this far future is grimdark as hell. And this all kicks off when the Lion takes his newly formed squad of Risen Marines to battle the forces of Vashtor and the World Eaters on the world of Wormwood. They show up to bail out the Dark Angels, who were hunting down Vashtor with everything they had. Literally every one of the Unforgiven chapters, including up to 3/4 of all their Marines, were on this mission. But before I can explain just how epic L. Johnson's return was and how much ass he kicked, I have to explain what it was he walked into, because the fighting had already become an absolute shit show. After Vashtor and his forces, along with Abaddon, had attacked the rock itself, the Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels, Azrael, called all the Unforgiven to his side to go wreck this new Vashtor guy's face. Similar to how in the devastation of Baal, Dante called all the Blood Angels' successors to defend their homeworld. They showed up, using successor chapters to harry the fleets of the other traitors who were protecting the sector. And the world they arrived at, Vashtor's spot where he was chilling, was a biomechanical nightmare world that seemed both alive and possessed. It was madness, a wasteland of flesh and steel. And of course the Dark Angels hit the ground and get a newly summoned Angron called right down on their heads. And the World Eater's Primarch would waste no time at all and totally ruined the Grand Master of the Deathwing's day and smashed him. Belial was shattered and broken, but the Dark Angels didn't have time to deal with that. In orbit, they were winning until Abaddon the Despoiler showed up with his fleet, and from Horus's old flagship itself, the Vengeful Spirit, the War Master led a counterattack that all but ruined the Unforgiven's fleet. And just when it looked like it would be a solid Chaos victory, both in orbit and on the ground, the Blood Angels fleet showed up and sent Abaddon packing, ostensibly to regroup for another counterattack. This turned the tide in the morale of the Marines fighting both on Wormwood and in its orbit. But the massive surprise of the announcement by Dante that they brought with them not only the Blood Angels as reinforcements, but the literal reawakened Primarch of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson himself, reinvigorated the Loyalists. Just as it looked like Angron was going to destroy the living hell out of the Deathwing, Commander Dante and the Sanguinary Guard themselves descended from the sky in their golden armor and came straight at the Red Angel. Blood Angels and Dark Angels alike started concentrating their fire on the World Eater's Primarch. And it started to work, a bit. But Angron was not about to be deterred by a few simple Space Marines, no matter how badass they were, and he absolutely smashed the Sanguinary Guard, and Dante. As the Red Angel Angron stood poised to deliver the killing blow and split Dante in half, the Dark Angels were shocked to see that the Lion emerged from nowhere, materializing from the shadows right between the broken Dante and Angron. Angron bellowed. Alright, so now you know what the Lion walked into. It's time to get into just what he did. The Lion looks over at Azrael and they exchange a glance which lets the Dark Angels know that it is up to them to win the day on Wormwood. The Lion literally puts a ton of pressure on Azrael, but conveys, again, all in just this one glance, that he will be running interference and taking on Angron one-on-one so that the Unforgiven can get the job done. And that's precisely what he does. The Lion in Angron's battle is absolutely epic. It covers a lot of physical space and descends deep into the depths of the biomechanical nightmare that is Wormwood. The Lion gets absolutely battered, but every time he is able to get his shield up between himself and Angron, the blows the Demon Primarch delivers reflect back on him. And this is where we truly see the power of the Emperor's shield. Nonetheless, it is the Lion's brain which defeats Angron. The Red Angel, having not slain anyone in over 2 minutes straight, is in terrible pain due to the butcher's nails, and this makes him annoyed. He doesn't even take the time to rationalize what it means that one of his loyalist brothers is before him fighting him. Angron just stays in his usual nuclear fury and only knows he's annoyed, and the only thing that's going to calm the nails is killing the enemy he's battling and going on to the next one. And the Lion uses this blind fury to his advantage, as they fight across what is essentially a Dark Mechanicus industrial weapons production plant. Lion uses a plume of steam and timing to cause Angron to overextend in his attack and impale himself on the tip of fealty. It wasn't a mortal wound, but it would be enough that it gave the Lion the upper hand and he could smash Angron with the Emperor's shield. And he used the point of the shield to repeatedly bash Angron in the neck until his head came off, causing the usual Primarch death explosion. Wormwood is starting to rupture and warp, the planet itself convulsing. The Dark Angel's Supreme Grand Master Azrael helps Dante regain his feet, and the two order a strategic withdrawal. Azrael states that he doesn't know where the Lion is, but knows that he will be able to get off the planet and into orbit. Azrael and Dante are the last two to board up, and the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels bear away as many of their dead as they can. But it isn't nearly enough. Between the events on Wormwood and in orbit, the fleet being smashed and whatnot, the Unforgiven have suffered unimaginable losses. Belial was mortally wounded and had to cross the Rubicon Primaris in order to remain alive. After the Lion Forest walks through the Mirror Caliban again, and rendezvous with the Dark and Blood Angels fleets, they see that Wormwood is the stitched back together, literally Frankensteined fragments of Caliban itself, and not even the Rock will be able to destroy it. Vashtor lets Abaddon know that he has completed his mission, to retrieve an artifact known as the Key. The Arcaphane activates the T'Chulcha engine, and Wormwood is sucked into the warp as Abaddon and Vashtor go searching for the Lock. Once they activate the Lock with the Key, they will have access to the weapon. So at this point, the Arcs of Omen story arc ends, and the Lion is returned to Warhammer 40k properly and reunited with his sons. And this is where things get pretty damn dark, because the Risen Marines are all fallen in the eyes of the Dark Angels, literally men they've hunted across time and space for thousands of years. When a Risen Marine patted Azrael on the back during the battle on Wormwood, Azrael was seriously uncool with it, even though the Marine had arrived with their Primarch and obviously had L. Johnson's blessing. It still didn't sit right with Azrael. So, they have a lot of healing to do. But what is weird is in the Dark Angels 10th edition codex, we get some really fun tidbits of lore concerning how this is all going. The Lion allows Azrael to remain titled Supreme Grand Master of the Unforgiven, and allows the Dark Angels to continue to hunt the Fallen. But it gets pretty deep and pretty dark here, because the Lion now wants to interrogate each of the Fallen himself, in private, alone. Sometimes he will emerge from an interrogation and let the interrogator chaplains like Asmodai take over and do the old business as usual for the Dark Angels. But other times the Lion and the Fallen will both have completely disappeared, ostensibly forest walking through Mirror Caliban. It so happens that occasionally after this happens, new members of the Lion's Inner Circle companions appear out of nowhere, and only he, and perhaps Azrael and Belial, know the identities of these Marines. So yeah, the Fallen who want to repent are allowed into the most hallowed place within the entirety of the Unforgiven, Lionel Johnson's trust. But it appears that nobody knows what happens to those who don't come back. What the Lion does with them has yet to be revealed to any beyond the Inner Circle and Grand Masters. Now that he is back, he's keeping secrets from his sons, which is only fitting as the Dark Angel's main trope has been secrecy for decades now. The hunt for the Fallen may be darker and more sinister than ever, but it offers redemption to those few who are both worthy and willing to take it. In a lot of ways, the Lion is letting the established order feel as if they still have control and a say, and they certainly get to keep up that facade for appearances. But at the same time, he is circumventing them and having the final say on everything. This fits with his sort of control freak personality, even if he isn't reactionary like he was when he was young. This all makes the Lion and the Dark Angels more compelling, in my opinion, than they were before he returned. But we have yet to see how the Lion and Guilliman will react to each other whenever they inevitably meet. And from what we know, the Lion is even more pissed off about the weird, superstitious, hyper-religious cult the Imperium has become than even Guilliman is, so they might be able to bond over that. But I don't honestly see it going well. I think that there are old wounds that need to heal, and I think that Guilliman will try to force the Lion into some sort of Imperial leadership role, when that isn't what the Lion is all about. When the Space Knight, now known as the Knight of Nihilus, takes to the field, he is a serious force too, as we see when the Lion arrives with the force of Successor Chapter's Marines to reinforce Lazarus and his men, who are just getting worked by Tyranids. The Lion appears much like he did before Angron, just right in the midst of battle, and immediately kills a Screamer Killer Carnifex as his Risen take down another with their greatswords. Lion engages a third and draws it into a kill zone where it's cut down by fire, before proceeding to absolutely destroy a Hive Tyrant. The Bug gets pissed after the Lion chops its sword arm off and uses its whip to grab Lion around the throat, but L. Johnson just bashes it with the Emperor's shield, cuts the whip, and decapitates the thing before going on to smash the now disheveled Tyranids. An absolute beast, who can appear out of thin air, anywhere in the galaxy, to confront the foes of humanity. Yeah, that's the Lion now. The Emperor's justice that can just materialize and wreck your day if you're on the wrong side of him. This is amazing for the Imperium's people, but it's sort of a loose cannon for the Ministorum and other administrative groups like the Ecclesiarchy. So when the Lion goes to a world, he shows up to help the citizenry, and the local armies, planetary defense forces, and even militias. The Lion seldom parleys with the leadership of any planets he goes to, as he sees the entirety of the Imperium as unworthy and corrupt. He'd rather work directly with the people who he's helping, in diametric opposition to Guilliman, who is trying to steer a sinking ship and using all the resources that are expected of him. Guilliman is thrust into the role of mini-emperor, where the Lion is still the same guy he was, the exterminator of the enemies of mankind. And what has happened in the past with the Dark Angels, the many secrets they keep will definitely come back to bite them. We still have yet to see how he will respond to Luther, and whether or not he will forgive his old friend. And we have yet to see how he feels about Cypher, who is carrying the Lion's sword and has recently worked with Guilliman. Now I, for one, as a Dark Angels fan and player, am still pissed off that Guilliman snapped the Lion's sword over his knee. That was pretty janky, but whatever. Fealty's awesome. But were the Seraphax plotline and the recent plotline in the Cypher novel as well foreshadowing? Is it in some way Lionel Johnson's fate to end the Emperor's life, finally killing the hollow corpse on the throne so that the Emperor can finally either return, as he is a perpetual, or ascend to true godhood and wreck face in the warp? After all, it seems that Cypher went into the throne room in order to use the Lion's sword to do just that, but was telepathically stopped by Big E and told not to not do it, but that it wasn't yet time, which is very interesting. Perhaps the darkest secret of all, beyond the murder of the neophytes on Caliban during the Heresy and beyond the fate of the Fallen and the Risen, is that the Lion is literally the Emperor's exterminator, something he is often called. But what if the term was not meant as the one who exterminates on behalf of the Emperor, but one who exterminates the Emperor? I know it is a bit of a stretch, but it's just a thought, and as I laid out, all the clues are there, including some pretty deep, decades-old foreshadowing that is only recently starting to pay off. We'll have to see where this all goes, but as of this moment, I'm calling it. The uncrowned prince, Lionel Johnson, truly is the darkest of the Emperor's angels of death, the first among demigods, unequaled by any being in the 42nd millennium. And like the 3rd edition Warhammer 40k rulebook stated in the margins, a dagger in the dark is worth 1,000 swords at dawn. Good thing for the Lion that he's both. Games Workshop have truly knocked it out of the park with his return, but we may yet still need to keep our fingers crossed in the hopes that the lore going forward continues to be this damn good. So there you have it, the return of the Lion, and what he's done, and what may happen going forward. There is no sin but ignorance. Magnus the Red. Magnus, the Crimson King of Prospero, the Cyclops, was intended to be the Emperor's sorcerer and is possibly Warhammer 40k's greatest tragedy. And the community is torn in half, divided into the factions who believe Magnus did nothing wrong, and it's all Magnus's fault. In this series, we've been diving deep into the Primarchs' natures and accomplishments, so strap into your robot pants for this one, because Magnus the Red may just be the most complex, tragic, and insane Primarch in the setting. For it is true that out of all the demigod sons of the Emperor, the master of mankind, it was Magnus who was to be his true heir, destined to sit the golden throne. And of all the Primarchs who turned traitor, it was perhaps Magnus who fell the hardest. Now, I have no doubt that were circumstances slightly different, that if the skeins of fate were woven and cut just a bit differently, that Magnus would not only have remained loyal to his father, the Emperor of mankind, but he would have been perhaps the greatest champion on the side of the Loyalists, with only the exception of the Emperor himself. And I believe this would have turned the tide of the war and probably saved the Emperor from what must have been an awful case of hemorrhoids at this point, after sitting for 10,000 years straight. That would put a strain on anyone, even the corpse of a god. So why is this one Primarch both revered and hated so much in the Warhammer 40k community? Well, to be honest, my opinion on this is that when you read his story and you see it from his point of view, you realize that Magnus is undoubtedly right in most of the things he does, or at least righteous and good in the reasoning behind everything he did. And the same is true when you read from the other perspectives, that he was wrong, insolent, recalcitrant, and insubordinate. So either way, you can believe what you want about the character and be right. Perhaps even more so than even Horus Lupercal. To say Magnus is complex is a massive understatement. Magnus is very much like the patron that he would come to serve, Tzeentch. Overly complicated and analytical, and with his semi-prescient abilities, he can come across as larger than life. Magnus was unique among the Primarchs, who were, as a whole, the most unique beings in the galaxy. He was able to remember his childhood, even his infancy and conception, and was telepathically communicating with the Emperor even before the Primarchs were scattered through the warp. He had exceptional abilities, and was undoubtedly the smartest of all of his brothers, intellectually. But as we'll see, brains are often inconsequential when common sense is required, and in that regard, Magnus was quite lacking. So, the world the infant Primarch was cast to was very, very far from Terra. Prospero, or Prospero, however you want to say it, was in fact the perfect place for a being such as Magnus to end up. It was a planet where sorcery and psychic abilities were highly regarded and openly studied, and they were used to warp shenanigans and weirdness, so to these scholarly occult types, the infant giant with bright red skin with extreme psychic abilities coming down from the heavens to dwell with them just seemed natural, and struck no one as out of the ordinary. It's just the sort of thing that happens there. So Magnus grew up learning magic and sorcery and surpassed all of his teachers in everything. Eventually, he was called into action to deal with a menace that had plagued Prospero for centuries, and was going to possibly cause the downfall of civilization on the planet. The Psychnoian, which were insectoid, wasp-like beings whose females would psychically inject their eggs into the brains of hosts. They were the size of a grain of sand, and when they hatched, after one day, they would begin to consume their host's brain. The population had to learn to control their psychic abilities more and keep them in check in order not to attract these monstrosities, but it took Magnus to quell them to the point of being a non-issue, and he became the hero of Prospero. Then, his father showed up. And why wouldn't he? With Magnus's huge brain and his super psychic abilities, the Emperor could sense his presence in the warp and came right for him. When he eventually landed on Prospero, he and Magnus embraced and picked up as if they had a lifelong relationship going already, which they did, unbeknownst to everyone around Magnus, because of that psychic connection and telepathic communication. The Emperor had never truly lost contact with his 15th son. Only in body were they separated. But now, reconnected with his father, Magnus's fate would unravel in the most mysterious of ways, and his own personal doom would be intrinsically tied to the doom of the Imperium of Man, the ruination of all the Emperor had fought to establish during the Great Crusade, and his father's internment upon the Golden Throne of Terra. The legion that Magnus inherited, those Astartes developed from his gene seed, were not quite up to standards. They were overwhelmed, as a legion, by rampant mutation. Magnus's gene seed was too much for them, in my opinion. And the Emperor and Magnus sought ways to fix this. They went scrying into the Empyrean, looking for knowledge that could help. And eventually Magnus was helped by a being he was unaware at the time happened to be Tzeentch. For the price of his eye, the Crimson King's legion's mutations were halted. A brief reprieve. But what Magnus didn't realize was that he had just bargained with the devil. He had sold his soul, not just his eye, to the ruinous powers. And at this time, nobody was aware of the existence of such beings. No human, that is, save the Emperor and Malcador, perhaps Constantine Valdor, but it was not known yet to the Primarchs. Something many criticized the Emperor for. For with a little forewarning and a bit of a heads up, everything Magnus wrought upon the galaxy could have been avoided. So the Sorcerer Lord of Prospero had invited Dracula into his house, but he didn't know it yet. So, as Magnus is going about his business, leading his legion, the Thousand Sons, he gets to know some of his brother Primarchs, and actually, even though he's a total nerdy bookworm, makes friends with Horus Lupercal, Jagatai Khan, and Lorgar Aurelian. As the Great Crusade goes on, these were his only real peers and friends among his brothers. But as he and his legion are prosecuting the Emperor's Great Crusade across the galaxy, they kept coming across worlds where sorcery was the way of that culture. Little did he know it was chaos cults he kept running into. But along the way, he gathered all of this arcane lore and knowledge of the warp and its denizens into a tome that would become known as the Book of Magnus, the most comprehensive occult tome compiled by man. As the crusade waged on, the Primarchs kept coming across horrific, monstrous entities using warp sorcery, and it got worse the further from Terra they went. And this made Magnus look pretty bad, cast him in a similar light as the horrors the Imperium was fighting, as the terrible horrors of the warp were even employing similar powers to Magnus and his Thousand Sons Legion. It made many of his brother Primarchs suspicious, and eventually it came to a head as the Emperor called for an investigation into the use of sorcery. And it did not go well. In fact, I'm going to preface explaining it by saying the Emperor did not act in a way suiting his majesty, and did something beneath his level of dignity. I believe he acted in a petty way, but that's just my opinion. Okay, so, after Leman Russ and Magnus almost killed each other over the use of sorcerous powers, the Emperor's debate forum on the use of psychic powers, more than anything else probably, sealed the fate of the galaxy. It let chaos in a big way, setting up a foundation with the Imperium's leadership that, to me, rivals even the machinations of Erebus and Corferon of the Word-Bearers. Russ pleaded to ban psychic powers, because Space Marines should be using brute strength and force. The Space Wolves claimed their own psychers were channeling the power of their homeworld, Fenris, rather than that of the warp, so the rune priests weren't committing the sin of sorcery. And Mortarion of the Death Guard narked his brother Magnus out for the use of what Mortarion saw as heretical sorcery. Ironic, as eventually Mortarion would become a demon Primarch and quite a powerful sorcerer himself. Magnus pled that all knowledge was good, and it was how you used it that could make it bad. He argued strongly for the use of psychic powers, but what had been intended to be a free and open debate ultimately proved to be more or less just the trial of Magnus the Red, and he pled his case in front of tens of thousands of people. Ultimately, the Emperor, rather than warning his sons that the warp they were playing in was toxic waste, completely forbade the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions from using any sorcery at all. And this was crushing for Magnus and the Thousand Sons. He was literally told his whole thing, his entire identity, the sorcery he'd dedicated his life to, was now illegal. The librarians of the legions were disbanded, and the librarians were sent to the ranks like all the regular soldiers and forbidden from using their strongest gifts. Magnus swore in front of everyone that he would obey his father's edict, but he totally had his fingers crossed. And of course, he and his legion continued to use sorcery in secret, which, can you blame him? I mean, he was literally the Emperor's sorcerer. But the Emperor had more sons than just the sorcerer, and among them was the executioner, Leman Russ, the Wolf King. And in what many think of as the ultimate defining moment of Magnus the Red, the two ended up pitted against one another. So, Magnus used sorcery to scry into the warp, and he saw visions of the future, for all the legions and their Primarchs except his own. Magnus saw Horus's betrayal and how it would play out for everyone, except the Thousand Sons and himself. And he tried to warn the War Master Horus not to betray their father, but it didn't work, and he did not have time to relay the message to his father via the typical astropathic channels, so Magnus decided to use the sorcery he was literally just forbidden from using to contact his father, and sought to project his message through the webway straight to Terra and the Emperor. There was a massive warp storm causing interference, so he had no other choice. He didn't know that the webway portion he found was one created by the Emperor for use by humanity, nor was he aware of the enormous psychic might it was requiring of the Emperor to allow the webway workers to remain safe, as the Emperor was simply holding the door closed on waves upon waves of innumerable demons. But Magnus's message was so important he risked everything to contact his father. So he basically blew a giant hole in the webway project and ruined everything. The webway gate beneath the Golden Throne was literally threatened. Demons flooded the human-built sections of the webway, slaughtering the mechanicum workers toiling endlessly on the project. In an instant, Magnus had ruined everything that the Emperor of Mankind had worked for literally tens of thousands of years. He destroyed it. And the Emperor was furious. Not only did he disbelieve that Horus could be a traitor, yeah, he was in total denial, but he believed that Magnus was lying and probably had turned to chaos himself. Big E wasn't wrong about that, but Magnus did not yet know it. This would become known as Magnus's folly. So the Emperor hung up the phone on Magnus and sent Leman to go fetch him, bring him back to Terra so he could get a spanking. But Horus, the ever-devious one, had not revealed himself to Leman Russ, and as Russ was going through the galaxy on his way to Prospero to get Magnus, Horus gave Russ new orders. He said that the Emperor had changed his mind and wanted Magnus dead and the Thousand Sons destroyed entirely. Russ, believing Horus was still loyal and still his war master and commanding officer, obeyed. And thus the burning of Prospero ensued. The Space Wolves massacred that world. They burned the libraries of occult knowledge that had taken Magnus centuries to accumulate, and Russ and Magnus engaged in single combat. It did not go well for them either. Either of them. Russ got one of his hearts literally punched out by Magnus, who, despite being the most well-read, smartest, and nerdiest of the Primarchs, was also among the physically strongest. Also, he could change size at will. When they engaged in combat, Magnus thought that he was going to die that day. He had foreseen that his captain Azik Ahriman would survive, and so entrusted him with securing the Book of Magnus. But Magnus could not see his own fate and believed that he was going to face Russ to die. And when they closed with one another, Magnus put up a veil of lightning energy around them so that none could disturb their conflict. And then he unleashed on Russ the same power, but it did nothing. Russ seemed oblivious to it. And he closed with Magnus, delivering a blow that cracked the Crimson King's breastplate. Magnus was shook and unleashed balefire that consumed Russ and lit his hair on fire, smashing a hole in Russ's armor in return. It went on back and forth, and to those outside the lightning field, the two seemed to grow like giants as the frost blade met the golden axe again and again. The battle between the Primarchs and also their legions was extremely epic, but that is the subject for another video unless you want this one to be 2 hours long. Essentially, Russ ended up getting horrifically, near fatally injured, but ended up also blinding Magnus's remaining eye and messing him up bad. He snapped Magnus's arm like a twig, something I've done to myself skateboarding, so I know that had to hurt. Yep, 12 screws and 2 plates in my arm. Then Russ eventually held the Crimson King up and did a pro wrestling style backbreaker over his knee and shattered Magnus. As he was set to deliver the killing blow, Magnus uttered a word that enacted a spell that sent himself and his entire legion into the warp. All Russ was left with was Magnus's words on the wind as the skies rained tears of oil for the Lord of Prospero. "You were a sword in the wrong hands, my brother. You have severed an innocent neck, and it will plague you forever." So after losing on Prospero and going into the warp and accepting Tzeentch into his heart as his personal lord and savior, Magnus no longer existed physically, but was now incorporeal. and a being of psychic might within the warp. Magnus was now ascended, but I have heard it said by more than one GW writer that all the traitor Primarchs who went Demon Prince in the end are technically dead. And yeah, Magnus might not have a consistent body any longer, but he may just be a spirit. But he's the strongest spirit ever and can manifest physically however he wants in an ever-shifting form. Oh, but wait. The side effects. Yes, he might just be a soul now, but he's a soul that was shattered. He is now many shards, and the shards are not all together. And some represent parts of himself he desperately needs, such as his honor, love, compassion, and humanity. But those shards, particularly the one that we're about to talk about, are out of his reach forever. So now that Magnus serves Tzeentch, and had, from his perspective, had the Space Wolves try to kill him and his legion, he joined the traitor cause and sided with Horus Lupercal in the attempt to overthrow the Emperor of Mankind. So, Magnus and the Thousand Sons were at the Siege of Terra, and Magnus gave Mortarion some advice on using his warp nature to control the constant pain he was in. This was really just a manipulation tactic that got the Death Guard to commit. Magnus was already acting as an agent of Tzeentch, even manipulating his allies. But he sneaks into the Imperial Palace and wants to slay the Emperor, who is stuck dealing with the Webway mess. While infiltrating the palace, he actually saves a group of refugees from Phosphex, which is basically a war crime. Anyway, he comes upon Malcador after entering the Hall of Lang, shout out to Lovecraft there, and he comes upon Malcador and Olivia Surica. Malcador is like, hey, play chess with her, but was trying to get Magnus onto his side. Eventually, Malcador reveals that the shard of Magnus that is his most noble part, his humanity and loyalty, are now permanently out of his reach, as Malcador used it to create the first of the Grey Knights. But Magnus, in his fury, slew Malcador, as even though it was thought that Malcador was second in power psychically to the Emperor, Magnus was far stronger. But even though Malcador was a perpetual and his death wasn't permanent, it still shook Magnus pretty hard. He didn't like having to do that. The funny thing is, no matter how hard you try, any person would be hard-pressed to paint Magnus as actually evil. Sure, he's a chaos-serving disciple of Tzeentch, but his heart is actually, well, usually, in the right place. Now, the son came before the father as Magnus enters the throne room. On their way, Magnus and his crew who snuck in with him met an apparition of the Emperor, like a projection, called Revelation. And Revelation leads them to the throne room unimpeded, right before the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Magnus dispels the projection of Revelation and goes to strike his father down, only to be blocked by Vulcan, before another epic Primarch battle ensued. And yes, it got pretty thick with Thousand Sons fighting salamanders. Big E opens his eyes and transports Magnus to a pocket dimension, floating through the Webway or somewhere like that, and he shows Magnus the future where no Primarch had turned. How the Webway project would have turned out and united the Imperium without the need for the warp or sorcery to travel, and how Magnus himself sat upon the Golden Throne, guarding the Webway gate while his soul projected through the cosmos, experiencing true bliss while he and his father learned the secrets of the universe together. And Magnus was allowed back into his father's good graces. The Emperor knew he messed up and that it wasn't Magnus's fault. But the catch was that Big E saw the Thousand Sons as too corrupted and would not be allowed back into the fold. So, they would need to be put down, and Magnus would be given a new, unmutated legion. And Magnus refused, outright rejected his father's offer. He would not betray his sons, the way his father had betrayed him. He said, "No way, not at all, sir," and was cast back into real space in the battle with Vulcan. Eventually he was going to lose, bad, and be destroyed. So Magnus fully let Tzeentch in at that point and accepted the full blessings of the Lord of Change and the Weaver of Fates and ascended to demonhood. And in doing so was immediately expelled from the Imperial Palace by the wards in place that kept demons out, ultimately saving him from Vulcan's wrath. And the fact that he did not betray his sons is literally the most defining characteristic of Magnus the Red to me. It isn't what he did or didn't do wrong. It is how he didn't punch down. And he was the best father in the galaxy. Absolutely a stand-up guy. in nearly every way. And of all the traitor Primarchs, I personally don't blame him at all for anything he did. I actually feel sorry for him and all that he was forced to do. What happened to Fulgrim is so horrendous, so disgusting, and so over-the-top grimdark that when I really think about it, it kind of makes me want to retch a little. Yeah, the Phoenician is who we're talking about today, and he's one of the best Primarchs in all of Warhammer 40k. An amazing character, both before and after his extremely hard fall. But is he just a metaphor for all of our own dark sides? For whatever secret hedonistic thing that we each keep from the world around us, but we can't live without? I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a YouTuber. But what I do know is that when it comes to Primarchs and Legions, the Phoenician and the Emperor's Children are a lot of fun. Featuring an Index Astartes in 2001's issue 255 of White Dwarf, if I recall correctly, the hedonistic followers of Slaanesh had me hooked from then on. Back in the early 2000s, those Index Astartes articles were often some of the deepest dives into the faction we had up until then. Usually we'd get the models and just a few paragraphs in a codex. But now there's a ton to know and a lot of lore, more than 20 years of it, and we can look at it. And when it comes to Fulgrim, some of the things he's done and some of the things that have happened to him are so extreme, it's stomach churning. And somehow, also a little intriguing at the same time, if you're a pervert. So cut yourself out a line of the dirtiest space coke distilled from the pituitary glands of 1 trillion virgin psychers and grab your space lube, because this is going to be one hell of a kinky one as we're heading right up to Slaaneshmas. Sorry for that last paragraph. I know it was a bit too much, but so is Slaanesh, and you're just going to have to deal with it. Now Fulgrim. The Palatine Phoenix was pretty much perfection. He was smart, he was strong, skilled, well-tempered, and could be both wrathful and respectful. But he was so full of himself. Like, he was really bad. And in my opinion, it was made so much worse after he met his father, the Emperor. Fulgrim was the kind of guy who could be put into a terrible situation and come through it and make it better, which is exactly what he did with the world that he was scattered to when the baby Primarchs were flung through the warp, Chemos. A dark world in perpetual twilight where the entire population had to endlessly toil to barely scrape by, and their very survival hinged on their mining. But after the baby Primarch was found, he became the youngest miner, and eventually, in true Primarch fashion, he took over. Starting as a slave, he went on to become a ruler, eventually defeating the other factions on Chemos and uniting its people. Fulgrim upped mining production to the point where Chemos had a surplus, and was able to trade for food and other goods. Eventually the society was able to shift, and things like the arts and science and music all came back and flourished. Once people didn't have to spend money every hour of every day just trying to survive, things got pretty good for the populace of Chemos. And ultimately that's who Fulgrim is deep down. He's the guy who takes something dull and oppressive and breathes life into it. But eventually the Emperor of Mankind came down to Chemos, and he landed in his Aquila Stormbird and was met by the police force of Chemos. They took Big E to Fulgrim, who just saw his father and fell to his knees immediately, prostrating himself before the Master of Mankind and pledging absolute fealty. And it made sense then why Fulgrim was perfection incarnate, why he did everything so well, why he was so smart and such a consummate fighter. Fulgrim was a son of the Emperor and a veritable demigod in his own right. The Primarch was destined for something great, for something extreme, and for something terrible. But he was unaware of any of it. Fulgrim was simply just compelled to follow. Unlike a lot of Primarch reunions with the Emperor, Fulgrim's went very smoothly. It was certainly a positive experience, unlike some of the other Primarchs who turned traitor and eventually became demons, such as Mortarion and Angron. But when Fulgrim inherited his warriors, he only got 200 guys, due to a catastrophe known as the Blight that was ruining their gene seed. So Fulgrim was determined to still make a go of it, though, and decided his 200 guys were going to kick as much ass as anyone else's guys. They eventually impressed the Emperor enough that the 3rd Legion was named the Emperor's Children by the Master of Mankind himself, and they were granted the incredible accolade of being allowed to display the Emperor's personal symbol, the Aquila, on the breastplates of their power armor. In the current Warhammer 40k setting, this is standard. Nearly every Space Marine has the Aquila proudly displayed across their chest. But back then, during the Great Crusade, the honor was for the 3rd Legion alone, and they earned it because the Emperor's children, under their amazingly charismatic and witty Primarch, were an absolute force. But he was at first relegated to serving under his brother Horus. Because his legion was so small, and I believe the Emperor didn't want to just send out 200 guys and see them get wiped out. A total party kill would look bad when it was one of his 20 legions and not just some PDF or Imperial Guard unit. Now that Fulgrim was found, the legion could be replenished at a much more rapid rate as his gene seed was readily available. So new legionnaires were created from aspirants from both Terra and Chemos. Eventually the Emperor's children were brought up to fighting strength, but it did take a few decades. And as for the Phoenix himself, Fulgrim's pride swelled beyond even where it was before. He was a prince of the universe, the Emperor's perfect son, a paragon of humanity. Yeah, Fulgrim's already massive ego and narcissism. Well, let's just say that it made his head swell up like Mr. Mackey. And the Emperor granted him a fleet of his own, the 28th Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade. And Fulgrim just tore through worlds, bringing them into compliance, becoming routine for him as he made his way through the galaxy. It was obvious that his years serving with Horus and his legion being attached to the Luna Wolves left its mark on Fulgrim's style of warfare and leadership techniques. He, being the massive egomaniac that he was, really wanted to prove he was the best Primarch that ever Primarched and could out-Primarch even the other Primarchs who were Primarchs among even the Primarchs. You get my point. Now, everything about Fulgrim was a flex. From his uniquely ornate armor called the Gilded Panoply to his extreme physical beauty, even his Primarch aura was strong and magnetic. Fulgrim was the embodiment of perfection, even in his physical form. But the way he weaponized his charisma and his flashiness foreshadowed his downfall. He's like one of those guys who places a lot of importance on showing off, having status symbols, etc. But this was all just hiding a deep, underlying insecurity. Let's just say he wore a lot of high collars. And for this Primarch in particular, it wasn't a matter of nurture, it was a matter of nature, which turned him ultimately to chaos. Fulgrim's entire personality was primed from the get-go for him to become exactly what he did in the end. And that is not his fault, nor his father's, for once at least. Fulgrim was neither neglected nor betrayed by the Emperor. His early days on Chemos were not easy, certainly. He was indeed enslaved. But did he have it bad as far as Primarchs go? Especially compared to some of his other brothers that turned to chaos who were actually good people at heart, like Angron and Horus? Now, one of my favorite things about Fulgrim is that he was married several times, always for political reasons, to unite one faction or another, etc., as he was rising through the ranks of Chemos' society. And I think it is very telling that he believes that he loved each one, at first, but always grew bored with them and ceased to care. Then they just grow old anyway, and he was effectively immortal. But I do think it kind of gives you a glimpse into the deeper aspects of the guy. Like a lot of psychopaths, narcissists, and sociopaths, he tells himself he's a good guy and that he's caring and does the right thing. But it's all just for protecting his self. And by self, I mean very fragile self-image. Because Fulgrim's greatest weakness, like any narcissist's, is himself. Someone who is entirely all ego like that, and thrust into such a position of galactic scale power, well, it sowed the seeds of Fulgrim's downfall long before he fell to Slaanesh. He basically was born with the exact right personality to develop all the addictions he would come to revel in, and may have proven to be a liability, even had he not embraced the god of excess and hedonism. Now, he was very competitive and quite a shit talker, especially with Ferrus Manus, who became his best friend. They were all boasts and banter and back and forth ripping on each other until they basically developed an unbreakable bond. And all of this happened on Terra as they forged, literally trying to have a forge-off to see who's the better, two of the most master-crafted weapons ever developed. Fulgrim claimed Ferrus's sword Fireblade was the better weapon, and Ferrus claimed it was Fulgrim's hammer Forgebreaker that was the winner. Either way, They had a super bro-off moment and swapped weapons, becoming best friends forever. And it must be said that out of all the Primarchs, I considered these two to have been the closest of friends. Perhaps Sanguinius and Horus's friendship was on that level, but yeah, two demigods who share an unbreakable bond. For many of the Primarchs, they couldn't stand most of their brothers, so Fulgrim and Ferris's friendship really does stand out. Now, when the Emperor's children finally hit the ground running and participated in the Great Crusade, they obsessed over facing worthy foes. Time after time, they'd subjugate worlds, and it would be too easy an accomplishment for them. And this is where boredom, however small at first, set in. And it is this boredom and the dulling of life's luster in general that I believe ultimately led to the damnation of both the Primarch and the Legion. But very early on, the Third Legion did meet a foe they found worthy, the alien race known as the Lair, a reptilian Xenos race who lived on Laren, a water-covered world with floating coral cities. They were, much like the Emperor's children themselves, great practitioners of the arts and respected refinement, beauty, and perfection. This snake-like race had applied all of those concepts to its own physiology and augmented themselves. They had bioengineered themselves and bionically enhanced themselves, and this was not lost on Fulgrim. But what was lost on him and his legion was they should not have rushed to attack the Lair as they did. Horus actually told Fulgrim not to, saying that the resources of the world, while vast, would exact too high a toll on the legions to seize. But Fulgrim didn't listen. He wanted glory. The race of aliens were extremely badass and put up one hell of a fight that Fulgrim absolutely reveled in, a worthy foe that facing would prove that his legion was the equal of any other. If he could exterminate the Lair, then the accolades would be plenty. Fulgrim might get a nice shiny medal pinned on his chest by the Emperor himself and told he's the greatest in front of all the other Primarchs, and that is just the kind of ego stroking that Fulgrim got off on. So that meant that he went in alone. He did not wait for other Space Marines to come back up the Emperor's children, he just rushed in to fight them. And yes, he took them out, but at a very high cost. Way too many of his Adeptus Astartes were killed in the fighting, seriously diminishing his legion's strength in a way that was out of balance with the gains made by taking the planet. After all, what was humanity going to do with an all-water planet? We couldn't live on it. The only habitable areas were all kept up by the use of Xenos, forbidden to humans, technology. Yeah, Fulgrim really had no reason to even fight the Lair, not on any real level. But that isn't the tragedy. Sure, the useless loss of life, the extermination of advanced species, was tragic. But this is where Fulgrim finally comes into contact with chaos and begins to lose everything. At the center of the main heart of the Lair society, they had a temple. The Emperor's children had to fight tooth and nail to enter it, as the main Lair resistance was centered there. And Fulgrim entered to the scene of a snake orgy. The Lair who remained were all the last of their race, and it seemed that the reptilians sacrificed themselves as an entire species and focused that into the master-crafted sword at the heart of the temple. The Emperor's children massacred the remaining snake people, and Fulgrim seized the blade of the Lair, and unwittingly became influenced by the Keeper of Secrets that had been summoned and bound within it. So Fulgrim came into possession of a blade that held a greater demon within it, and he was still ignorant of the fact that demons exist. Now, over time, the blade would whisper the most messed up things to Fulgrim, and he would just assume that it was his subconscious just getting very, very dark. He wasn't really able to reason what was right in front of him. He is, after all, a narcissist, so assumed the voices in his head were his own. After all, who would have the power to penetrate the mind of a Primarch? Nobody, or so Fulgrim assumed. Now, this blade was in his hand or on his waist at all the most inopportune moments, whispering its seductive secrets into the Primarch's mind's darkest corners. And he was turning on his most loyal friends, advisors, and confidants, and his mind spiraled out of control with paranoia. This blade resulted in Fulgrim basically developing borderline schizophrenia, as his paranoia became absolutely overwhelming. Fulgrim was seen more often wielding and carrying the Lair blade than he was seen with his own master-crafted power sword forged by his brother Ferris, Fireblade. Whenever the Primarch was without the possessed Blade of the Lair, somehow one of his subordinates would bring it to him and kid him out with it. And this was at its worst when Fulgrim and the Emperor's children were called in as reinforcements when the Iron Hands and Ferrus Manus were facing a coalition of humans and aliens known as the Diasporex. One that was giving them some real problems, or as my old roommate would have said, they were giving him a lot of guff. The Diasporex humans refused to leave their alien allies and join the Imperium, and so, based on the rules upon which they were persecuting the Emperor's will, the Primarchs decided to wipe them out. At first, they don't know why the Diasporex won't leave the sector and flee to a safer area, but eventually, they discovered that the coalition of humans and aliens are using the local star as a fuel source and had a series of solar collectors. The Imperial fleets attacked the solar arrays, and the Diasporex came out of hiding, totally taking the bait. And these guys were no slouches when it came to war. The Diasporex were amazing at naval warfare, and even able to cripple some of Ferrus's ships, such as the strike cruiser Ferrum. The coalition of humans and Xenos put up one hell of a fight. Fulgrim's gunship, his personal ship, the Firebird, came under heavy attack and things looked grim. But Ferrus rushed to his brother's side, with his flagship, the Fist of Iron, basically saving Fulgrim. And Fulgrim was pissed. In response, he led a boarding action against the Diasporex and just absolutely massacred his way through the enemy troops. But Solomon Demeter got to the bridge first and slew everyone. The Diasporex commander said, "We only wish to be left alone." When Fulgrim arrived, he was pissed again. He wanted the glory of ending the fight and slaying the enemy's commanders. And just because one of the Marines got there and did his job before he could, Fulgrim felt slighted. And then he throws a tantrum and is pissed at Ferrus Manus for saving him. He doesn't see it clearly for the altruistic act of heroism it was. He thinks that Ferrus had some ulterior motive or some hidden agenda in saving him. It got pretty silly. Fulgrim obviously needed help. If you've ever had a family member addicted to meth, then you'll know what Ferrus was going through. Fulgrim had changed and was buying into his own bullshit. Over the following months, Fulgrim felt that his brother, who had lost a ton of guys saving his ass, saved him for his own glory, not to actually help Fulgrim. Fulgrim had been treading a path toward damnation, and neither he nor his brother Ferrus, nor his Emperor's children, could see it. Oh, and for those of you who are wondering, what about Bekwa Kinska and her Maraviglia? Well, that will be in a video specifically about the Emperor's children, and I will get to it. But, got to keep the focus on the Primarch in this video. So one of my favorite scenes in all of the Horus Heresy is where Fulgrim meets with the Eldar Farseer, Eldred Ulthrin. The Space Elf Wizard tries to warn Fulgrim, and he's being straight up honest. But at first, he doesn't realize that Fulgrim is under the influence of Slaanesh. So he's telling Fulgrim that Horus got stabbed by the Kennebrak Anathame, a dagger corrupted by Nurgle, the Chaos God. And Fulgrim is like, "What's a Chaos God? What's a Nurgle?" Eldred starts to explain it, but as he's doing so, if I remember this correctly, he realizes that Fulgrim is ever so slightly coming under Slaanesh's influence, and he knows he's made a terrible mistake. Battle ensues, and the Emperor's children, I believe it was the Phoenix Guard specifically, ravaged the Eldar. Fulgrim was provoked by the Lair Blade to attack, as it goaded him on, telling him that the Eldari were lying and trying to trick him, that Horus would never get corrupted by a poop knife, etc. All a bunch of paranoid garbage, but he bought into it, and, unprovoked, attacked. He killed a Wraith Lord, which when I read it was a big deal to me, as my Wraith Lord was never defeated, not even once in 3rd edition. Yeah, it may have been broken as hell, but it was the strongest model in all of Warhammer 40k at the time. So in my mind, I was like, holy crap, this guy smashed a Wraith Lord, his guys killed all the Farseer's retinue, and he then goes toe-to-toe with an Avatar of Cain. Well, I'm pretty sure that the kid from Space King 2, even with his treads, could take an Avatar the way they write them in the lore. But yeah, he chokes it to death, which I thought was weird. But okay, hell of a Primarch move if you ask me. But of course, Eldred Ulthrin, being the Eldar's main character, gets away to live and fight another day, and show up in more Horus Heresy novels later. So Fulgrim goes to Horus, his brother who he is closest with next to Ferrus Manus. And Horus has an 18 charisma on a bad day. He's easily able to turn the corrupted Fulgrim fully to his cause and against the Emperor. Fulgrim just had to be sold the line that chaos is the avenue through which humanity, and he himself, would be able to achieve perfection. Yeah, for whatever reason, perfection was still something Fulgrim constantly obsessed over. So, he cast aside the Imperial truth and fully turned to chaos. It was a slow drip, but in the end, he made a conscious choice to accept it. Then Horus sends Fulgrim to meet with Ferris, because if anyone can sway the Gorgon to the War Master's side, it is Fulgrim, his best friend. And well, that went pretty poorly. Of course, Ferris Manus didn't take any of what Fulgrim had to say very well. He flew into a rage, a very violent rage, backed up by a ton of self-righteousness and vitriol. He was intent on murdering Fulgrim right there, aboard the Fist of Iron, in the Anvilarium, and nearly did so. It was all Ferris could manage to do. He needed to put down the rebellion right then, right there. The ensuing battle was fierce, and Fulgrim almost got Ferris. But Ferris was able to grab Fulgrim's sword, Fireblade, the very sword Ferris had gifted him. But his necrodermis arms and the sword reacted, and it exploded in his grip. The Primarchs were flung back from one another, and Ferris was unconscious. Fulgrim, hearing the whispers of the Keeper of Secrets in his lair blade, goading him on to finish his brother. And he nearly did so. But he was able to resist, and he never wanted to harm his brother, only convince him of his newfound truth. Fulgrim hefted the hammer Forge Breaker and took it, instead of smashing Ferris's head in, as the demon blade suggested. He left the shattered pieces of Fireblade for his brother and exited the inner sanctum of the Iron Hands Primarch. And then the Phoenix Guard killed, by decapitation, all the Morlocks who were Ferris's bodyguard that were there. Fulgrim fled to his shuttle, the Firebird, and went back to his flagship. Then his fleet opened up on the Iron Hands fleet, causing massive damage before the Emperor's children split. Fulgrim had failed to convert Ferris, and this did not please the War Master. Eventually, the Emperor's children would take part in the events of Istvan III and Istvan V, and it was there, at the fifth planet in the system, when Horus sprung his ultimate trap that ruined 3 of the Loyalist legions entirely, that Fulgrim finally came face to face with Ferris again. The battle was insane. I really suggest you guys read this one for yourselves. But the fighting got up close, hand to hand, as the Morlocks and Ferris made a final stand. Ultimately, Fulgrim didn't really realize he was possessed, and in the end was unable to stay his hand, despite both his brain and his heart telling him to. And he slew Ferris Manus in single combat, lopping his brother's head right off. And Fulgrim had a moment of clarity. He was aggrieved, he was repentant, he was regretful, and he was a fratricidal murderer. The lair blade called to him, seducing him, and he was unable to resist it. Fulgrim tried to kill himself, about to stab himself through the heart, but the blade would not let him. It insisted that he remain alive, and offered him a new level of damnation. Fulgrim accepted, not just chaos, but found his patron in the god of excess, pleasure, and pain, Slaanesh. The greater demon took over his body, basically displacing and replacing his soul. Fulgrim was trapped in a tiny pocket within his own mind, shut out and unable to control his body in any way, but was aware of what the demon was doing, which the demon really got off on. Ultimately, Fulgrim's soul would be trapped within a painting of himself that hung in the auditorium aboard his battle barge, the Pride of the Emperor. The very auditorium where the Meraviglia was performed by the remembrancer/composer Bekwa Kinska, who was corrupted upon Laren along with Fulgrim and his marines. But, like I said earlier, that's for another video. But this painting is made of bodily fluids, painted with blood, semen, feces, and other things that are byproducts of human existence. To say it is gross is a huge understatement. Still, it is rendered in an exquisite and unique perfection, absolutely detailed. Horus could tell his brother was possessed. Immediately, he knew it, but he still wanted the Third Legion on his side, so struck a deal to keep the secret so long as the demon served him in the same capacity that Fulgrim would have. They agreed, There was a bit more to it than that, but you get the point. So this greater demon of Slaanesh is puppeting Fulgrim around, using his body. 4 days after the Istvan V drop site massacre, Horus gathered the traitor Primarchs for the first time aboard the Vengeful Spirit. And it was very interesting. Not all were physically present. Kurz and Alpharius, I believe, were holograms, attending through FaceTime, while Magnus was a psychic projection, but the rest were there. And Lorgar loses his absolute shit. He knows that it isn't Fulgrim. He knows that the body is a soulless husk piloted by an abomination. He whips out his Crozius and smashes Fulgrim with it, sending him into the wall. And none could stand before Lorgar. He was swole with the powers of the warp. Horus tried to calm him, and Lorgar was so strong psychically that Horus was forced to remove his hand from Lorgar's shoulder. Eventually they talked, and Lorgar was pissed that Horus knew such a secret and kept it from the Primarchs, stating that the Gal Vorbak, his own possessed marines, were not such an abomination because they still retained their own souls. But whatever happened to Fulgrim needed to be ended. Horus agreed that it was bad, but assured Lorgar he was planning to release Fulgrim from his torment as soon as he could. But Lucius, a captain of the Emperor's Children, saw through the demon's ploy, and he led his warrior lodge to capture Fulgrim and try to remove the demon from him. Eventually, after much blood was spilled, the officers of the Emperor's Children were able to subdue and restrain Fulgrim, who had been knocked unconscious. And well, they tried to remove the demon through a process called excruciation. They tried to torture it out of him, and in the process discovered that it was actually Fulgrim, that he had subdued the demon and had switched places with it, locking it in the painting, and that he had been enacting an elaborate ruse to get everyone to think he was still the demon, for whatever reason. He did love being tortured, though. He forgave his sons for doing it to him immediately, but yeah, he totally got off on it, a sign of his Slaaneshi corruption. Now, one thing that Horus did was he gifted the hammer Forgebreaker to Perturabo as a boon, and to try to curry favor with the Lord of Iron. I always thought that was lame of him to jack Fulgrim like that, but he did nonetheless, so now Perturabo wields the hammer. But Fulgrim used Perturabo in an elaborate ruse, tricking him to believe that there was a secret WMD called the Angel Exterminatus in the Eye of Terror. He called for the Emperor's Children and Iron Warriors to join forces and seek the artifact. This is where Slaanesh's forked tongue was in action, as Fulgrim stated that it was going to make all of Perturabo's desires come true, and in a way that would be most satisfying for him. He'd finally be fulfilled. But it was all a fake-out, a scheme to ascend to demonhood, under his own conditions, not being possessed by a keeper of secrets. Fulgrim attempted to sacrifice his brother Perturabo to achieve apotheosis, and he nearly succeeded in that sacrifice by using a trick involving a Magatar stone that sapped Perturabo's strength. It's a pretty insane scene and goes pretty deep. They fight Eldar constructs and the Iron Hands, survivors of the Dropsite Massacre, along with a few salamanders and a single Raven Guard. The Raven Guard, Naakona Sharokin, realized that Fulgrim desired the stone and shot it with a bolter. This reinvigorated Perturabo, who got his strength back, and he hefted Forgebreaker and absolutely smashed Fulgrim, obliterating his body. And Fulgrim didn't care. He got his apotheosis. On an Eldar crone world within the Eye of Terror, Fulgrim ascended to demonhood. The ritual he was conducting didn't care that he was the sacrifice, or his brother Perturabo. And Perty thought that he'd killed Fulgrim, but the Phoenix rose from the ashes, a twisted, snake-like demon with 4 arms and bat wings, a horrific, truly gorgeous, absolutely hedonistic image sculpted by Slaanesh himself. And that is how Fulgrim became what he is today. And he's been more or less silent since then, coming out only occasionally from his pleasure planet in the Eye of Terror. Fulgrim is not seen often in the lore anymore. He did, however, slit Gilliman's throat, so that's a really big deal. And he's in the Eidolon book, still running what he can, but his sons are all such a bunch of self-righteous hedonists that they're incapable of acting as one unified force anymore. And don't worry, we'll get to Eidolon in a future video too. It's in the works. Fulgrim does seem to be the one that Teke the Smiling One is directly working for in the Beckwin books, so he is active, just operating behind the scenes so far. But everything is primed, and the stage is set for his epic and glorious return to the setting. He'll be center stage in the unfolding narrative that is about to drop in a few months, and I, for one, cannot wait. But how has 10,000 years of demonhood affected the Primarch? Here's a little excerpt from the novel Manflayer about Fabius Bile, who I had forgotten to mention actually cloned Fulgrim at one point, and the clone was loyal and repentant. "Oh, Fabius, really, the arrogance of you." Fulgrim reached up and plucked a piece of fruit from a hanging vine. He took a bite, and dark juices ran down his chin and chest. "You never left the trap, boy. The moment you set foot in the Lair Temple, you were caught fast, the same as the rest of us. Granted, your desires took a more circuitous form than I might have predicted. But the end result is the same. You are no less a slave to your lusts than any of your brothers. And are you a slave as well, father?" Fulgrim took another bite of fruit, giving every sign of relishing the taste. "I was born a slave, Fabius, and even after I took Chemos, I was still a slave. The anathema came and made all my accomplishments as ashes." He gestured with a juice-stained claw. "That is the story of us. We are tools, made for a purpose. We were no more in control of our destinies than your scuttling vatborn. When I realized this, I knew that the only true freedom lay in choosing my own master." Now, one thing I really want to emphasize is just how repentant Fulgrim really is. He questions his decisions many times, and even though he puts up a front of absolute devotion to Slaanesh and belief that he did the right thing, he doesn't believe that himself. Fulgrim hates himself for what he's done, for betraying his father, for killing his brother and best friend, or at least he did before he achieved his Demon Primarch status. I'm really hoping that we see not just a return of the Snake Demon guy, but also of the noble Fulgrim, possibly in the form of his clone. Who would be better to confront an absolute narcissist than himself?